Hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I think this is everyone from the breakout or from the waiting room so far, but I think we can get a head start, and then once people join, they can just pop in. So hi everyone. Thanks. My name is Cindy, and I'm so excited to be moderating this chat today. I'm with Sim. Today we're really lucky to have Simeon Simeonov to be joining us. He's a serial entrepreneur with experience ranging across really a multitude of different industries, from deep tech enterprise to security, ad tech, health, AI, and consumer social media. He's also a VC, angel investor, and Techstars mentor. And it's, just truly remarkable the breadth and rate of success that Sim has had as an entrepreneur and investor. And there's certainly a lot that I'm looking forward to learning from him today. Among his current roles, Sim is the co-founder and CTO of Swoop, where he improves patient outcomes by accelerating promising therapies using large-scale privacy-preserving AI. However, this short introduction certainly doesn't capture nearly all of who Sim is. So I'm just going to hand it over to Sim and let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me on a Sunday afternoon. I know it's not the best time to be chatting about startups or to be chatting about anything related to business. I guess I'll summarize in his introduction was eventually, I hope I'll figure out what I want to do when I grow up. Not there yet, though. I'm just trying too many different things. So that's it about me. Happy to chat with you. We have a few things that we want to cover, which I think important for some of the experience you're hopefully going through, but hopefully we also have plenty of time for questions. And if you want to ask questions, drop them in the chat and Cindy will pick them up from there and we'll ask.
Definitely. Yeah, we have a really small group today, so this is like an awesome opportunity to have, I guess, more engagement. So if you have any questions, feel free to either message them in the chat or just like use the raise hand feature, and we can get you to ask the question live and to get some live feedback and or an answer as well. So that'll be exciting. Just letting in one more person from the room. Okay. I guess just to kick off the conversation, we have a couple of things planned. But yeah, super flexible, and make sure to just message in the chat. And also while we're talking, I guess it'd be awesome to hear a little bit about like all the participants on the call today, maybe the companies that you're running, and if you're a student, perhaps like what you're studying, what you're interested in, and I guess, just why you're interested in entrepreneurship. So yeah, looking forward to reading some of those in the chat.
Yeah, love to see that. So drop a line.
I guess just to kick off the conversation, let's talk a little bit about this idea of like optimization. So many of the founders on this call today are also students or also founders who are balancing several other hats. So I guess just like my first question is just like, as an entrepreneur, how are you able to evaluate like whether you're optimizing your time, your actions, and just like your efforts? And how do you make this an intentional effort?
That's a great question. It's a really hard one. Just zooming out for one more bit, I find that some of the most valuable skills of founders are actually life skills, and not specific to startups. They're just things that are useful in all parts of life, business, personal relationships, school, you name it. And one of those is figuring out whether you're spending your time well. It's your most precious asset. So people tell you to find a balance. And it sounds like, this magical thing is this one balance point and you just have to find it. That's almost kind of the task is demotivating. So I like to think of it as a 3-step process. Ultimately what you're doing is you're doing multidimensional optimization, which anybody who does data science or anything related to optimization will tell you it's a really hard problem. Why multiple dimensions? Well, because you have to maintain your body. Many of you who are in school, you have to do well in school. You're also dealing with startups. You may have relationships. No matter which way you look at it, there's many dimensions of our life that we need to be, if not excellent at least decent at, while trying to be excellent at something else. So the hardest part, I think, is figuring out what the dimensions are. A lot of people take things for granted and end up ignoring important aspects of their life and find themselves in a situation where something unexciting happens. In many cases also that, perversely in some sense, spending more time on startups and more time on business can actually reduce performance in startups and business. Simplest example is if you spend way too many hours and don't take care of yourself and don't sleep, you may still execute, but your creativity will go down. There's countless research supporting that. If you really need to be creative, you need to have enough sleep. It's just a cause and effect thing. And that's just one minor example. So to me, again, the hardest part is to even identify the dimensions that you're optimizing across. Then comes the question as to whether on your possibility frontier. I don't know how many of you have heard the term of possibility frontier. It tends to come from economics. Basically, it's the point in this multidimensional space you're trying to optimize across, where you can't get more of something you want without getting less of something else you want. And in other words, any transition from one point to another is not Pareto optimal. Pareto optimality is another concept from economics, which basically is the inverse of that. It's you make a Pareto optimal change if you can get more of something without losing anything that you care about. So obviously, if you're not at a Pareto optimal point, if you're not on your possibility frontier, then the question is, how do you get there? Right? The simple example is, in economics, the use is imagine your economy that just makes guns and butter, and you can make lots of guns, you can make lots of butter, and you can make some amount of guns, some amounts of butter. In personal life, in startup life, the ways to increase your total output or of the entity, as you're thinking about startup as an extension of yourself, one of it is by selling your idea to co-founder, or to somebody who wants to work nights and weekends without a salary to help you succeed. There are many ways to actually expand the entire surface of what is possible, which then gives you more choices for how to optimize. That's a pretty hard problem, thinking creatively about this. And then the third problem you have to solve is, if you kind of roughly understand what's possible, is actually deciding which point on the surface of optimal points do you actually want to operate in, right? Do you want to sleep 5 hours tomorrow and do a few more hours of startup work? Or do you need to sleep 7 hours and do a few less hours of startup work? How do you optimize if you're in school, exams and grades? What grades are important to you? So those are the three pieces that I'd like to talk people through when they think about optimization. The first one is, what are the dimensions? And really think carefully across your whole life about what those dimensions are. 2, creatively think about how to expand your possibility frontier. And 3, pick where on the possibility frontier you want to operate. And it's not a fixed point, right? Based on your needs, based on the changing demands in your life, even if you're in school, based on school schedule, you may actually adjust. But the amount of productivity or gain you can get by simply optimizing your own life, and startup being a big part of that, it's one of the biggest things you can do to optimize the outcome of your startup.
Yeah, that makes like a lot of sense. And thanks so much, Sim. I guess just like one follow-up question, like you mentioned like this idea of how like when we are like choosing or I guess like the point that we want to be on this possibility frontier, like this is often going to be like changing, like depending on the circumstances, depending on the time. And I think just like a related question to this idea of optimization. Just like looking at like your background and all like the wide range of companies that you founded. I think just this idea of like optimization and being like agile and flexible, like really comes to mind. And I think like I can't think of anyone else better to ask this about. So yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like just like the power and the importance of agility when deciding like at what point on the possibility frontier we should be situating ourselves in.
That's also an excellent question, especially in an early stage startup, right? Imagine yourself just with an idea. You haven't raised money, you have no other co-founder. You could literally change your mind about what you can do in an hour, right? And change the entire company. It's very different when you have 1,000 people and money from investors and you told them you're going to do certain things. And there's everything in between in that scale. So agility certainly is a form of superpower that startups have, and in particular early stage startups have more of it, because the bigger you get, the more inertia you pick. And then obviously the more inertia you have, the more effort and time it takes to change direction. But obviously, agility can be, like most superpowers, can also be a weakness. You being to be too agile and essentially not make forward progress. That was many years ago, more than a decade ago, when I was a venture capitalist. I watched a bit of the Nature Channel unfold in my backyard. I watched the fox chase a bunny, and it was kind of an interesting example of why startups do so much better than bigger companies. So the bunny was essentially running away from the fox in a straight line, but it was zigzagging along that straight line. And you think about the bunny, it's a fairly light animal, big hind legs. Its sort of evolutionary design is very well suited to this type of movement. The fox was chasing it, and it was chasing it along roughly the same line, but for some reason, the fox was trying to follow the tacking of the bunny. Fox is a much bigger animal, different leg structure. And so every time the fox tried to change direction, the fox kept losing speed. And so the bunny just got away. You can imagine the fox being a larger company. Larger companies are not good at being very agile. If they try to change course too frequently, they just end up grinding to a halt. Startups are great at agility, but you want to be like the bunny. You want to know roughly the direction in which you're going, and then make course corrections as you see data. But generally speaking, it's important to make progress. In the lean startup movement, some people have elevated the pivot to sort of put it a bit on a pedestal, and we should recognize that pivots are great compared to failure, but pivots are not better than success. So it's great if you can figure out the direction you want to go into and just pick up a lot of momentum and turn out to be right. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And some of the best founders in my experience are a little schizophrenic. 90 some odd % of the time, they think they're invincible and they just follow their conviction. And a few % of the time, they kind of take stock, bring in a lot of data from the outside world, and question every assumption they've ever made.
Thanks for sharing that example. I remember when you first told me that example, I was like, oh, that's an interesting way to, I guess, put it into context. Just really understanding, that difference and that balance. I'm wondering, in your personal experience, having, I guess, not really pivoted startups, but I guess wrapped one up and moved on to the other. I'm wondering at what stage did you decide that it was time to, I guess, move on and time to, I guess, hand the company over? And I'm wondering if you have any advice for the founders on this call today who might be in a similar situation.
There's many ways to think about this question. So the companies I started, only one failed, and it failed because my co-founder and I euthanized it 7 months after we started it. Not because it wasn't going to work, it was going to work, but it wasn't going to be profitable enough. And so if you think about success and failure, a friend of mine, Esther Dyson, as a saying, always make new mistakes. I like to add quickly and cheaply to that, because quick and cheap mistakes are fine. You can make lots of those and still do well. It's the slow and expensive mistakes that is difficult to recover from. So in other words, if you're going to fail, try to sort of pick the most direct path at failure, because again, time is your most precious asset. One of the most dangerous things that I've seen in the startup universe is a founder who thinks they have only one great idea in life. And this is their one ticket to success, fame, glory, wealth, changing the world, etc. So they're going to hold on to that one idea and never going to let go, no matter what happens, no matter what happens in the outside world, no matter what feedback they get. And that, if they happen to be right, if they happen to be Steve Jobs, who, can call the future many years ahead, is a wonderful thing, right? But statistically speaking, that level of conviction to sort of the total ignorance of the external world actually leads overwhelmingly to failure. It just tends to lead to slow failure. And that's what you don't want to do with your life. As to how do you know where it is? It's really tough. I mean, confidence, conviction, passion, there are superpowers. Again, if too much of them, they turn into poisons. They blind you to the rest of the world. But a little bit of blindness is a good thing. A little bit of ignorance is a good thing. Um, as the saying goes, you did it because you didn't know it couldn't be done.
Yeah, and on this point of, I guess, like the balance between like ignorance and the balance between, I guess, like knowing too much, I'm wondering, like, if is there like ever a time when, like, when we think about like this context in like a startup context, for like entrepreneurs knowing like an industry like not enough, or entrepreneurs knowing like the industry, I guess, like too well, can like that ever be a problem, I guess? And if that is like how are those, like, I guess, like pitfalls that like entrepreneurs can like try to avoid? And I guess, like, how do we find like that balance between those two?
Again, balance is hard. And we talked about it, but I have often observed people who know an industry really, really well can figure out all the 100 possible ways that startup can fail. And again, very frequently, the people who end up truly changing an industry are people who know something about it, but are not sort of super deeply embedded in it. They bring in a bit of that, child's mind, the beginner's mind into it, a little bit of ignorance, a little bit or a lot of confidence, and just go at it either in a different way or simply sort of unafraid by the knowledge of all the possible ways things can go wrong.
Mhm. Definitely. And I guess just like one last question on this topic, balance, before we shift the conversation to perhaps like investor feedback. I'm wondering if you could talk like a little bit more about like this balance between I guess like insecurity versus like arrogance as an entrepreneur, and how like we're able to find like confidence somewhere in between.
It's really hard, and it's especially hard because there are macro and societal factors that affect it, right? So, for example, investors are overwhelmingly male. That's changing, but it's not changing sufficiently quickly. And you know about the gender biases in perception of confidence in men versus women, especially when observed by men versus women. So that's a very complicated situation to navigate. Um, at any one point in time, there's a bit of a there's a bit of an ethos. There's sort of an expected um, prototypical founder um, that investors are looking for, and if you don't fit and you don't find a way to tell a story about yourself that makes not fitting turn into a strength, that can actually really hurt your fundraising chances. I was advising a company which is now public, um, where they're based in the Bay Area, and the co-founder is this super smart, super nice guy who just didn't emit the sort of braggadocio typically associated with young male founders um, that in the Bay Area investors looked at. And it consistently hurt his fundraising chances. We corrected some for it, and again, the company was very successful. It's public now, but it was a problem simply because he talked and behaved differently. He was soft-spoken. He was much more thoughtful. Um, he was more qualified in his answers, um, and so on and so forth. So it's a very delicate balance to achieve, even externally, let alone internally, which was what your question was more focused on. Internally, it's hard. I mean, you really don't benefit much from a voice kind of nagging at the back of your head that you're not good enough for something. That simply that type of self-doubt is not constructive, right? And there's lots of people and approaches. Again, it's a general life skill to get rid of that. Um, you want quote unquote negative feedback to be much more substantive and actionable, right? Like you're not thinking smartly about X. So you can figure out how to think better about X. You educate yourself, you talk to people who are smarter than you about X, and so on and so forth. Um, so I'd say again, separate self-doubt that's just inherent and self-referential um, from actionable objections about, okay, how do I get really, really good at whatever I need to be good at? How am I confident that I'm good at? And some of it can be managed through processes such as customer development, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with the methodology, originated in Steve Blank. Um, if you haven't heard about it, definitely get his original book, Four Steps to the Epiphany, and then the larger book he did with Bob Dorff, which is a Startup Owner's Manual. But fundamentally, customer development is a methodology typically aimed at technical co-founders, really anybody. It's an algorithm for verifying the assumptions uh, that underlie so many of the decisions in building a company. And if you just follow the algorithm, you will experience likely two sets of things. First, uh, you'll feel dumb and bad because you'll be forced to much more quickly than we often feel comfortable to um, recognize the fact that a number of your ideas don't seem to be as good or as smart or as true when against the real world um, as you wish them to be as an optimistic entrepreneur. You'd also be forced to do things that perhaps you're uncomfortable with, like getting feedback really, really early, whether that means cold calling somebody or sending unsolicited emails or approaching people at a Starbucks, not so usable in pandemic times, but you know what I mean. And again, but facing these fears, facing these challenges early on, that's a good thing, right? Ultimately, if you realize you're not a person who can do that, well, maybe you're still a great founder, but perhaps you're a different type of founder. Maybe not a great founding CEO, maybe a different type of founder that needs a co-founder who can balance your strengths and your weaknesses. Um, so fundamentally, you want to go in a process where it's back to this idea of failing quickly and cheaply, right? It's perfectly fine for you to constantly learn that you are, quote unquote, dumb about some things or not very good at some things, as long as they're bite-sized and actionable things that you can improve, and as long as you learn this fairly quickly. Just keep doing that, and by definition, you'll get better and better and better, and you'll get more and more confident of your decisions and of the actions you're taking because they're going to be built on this foundation of tests and experiments and knowledge that have been verified, that are not simply there because of your personal conviction and your passion. You need a lot of passion to push you through all these uncomfortable moments, right? You want your passion to be aimed not at supporting an empty conviction, right? But at supporting the actions that lead to a substantiated conviction.
Yeah, definitely. I think like the difference, like it's like minute, but it's like a subtle difference, but like a very important, I guess, like distinction to make there. Yeah, and I think just like this like conversation or this like discussion about like the ideas of like balance and optimization have probably like raised like more questions than they've answered. But I think that's like one of like the beautiful things about like calls like this is that even if we're unable to, I guess, talk about everything and resolve like all the thoughts during the call, it's certainly like opened up a lot, like many more avenues of like thought to really like consider how we can apply those to our startup lives, but also I guess to our everyday lives. And the point that you brought up about, I guess, like receiving like harsh and negative feedback, whether that's in the face of failure or if it's just like like before you're able to reach success. That like flows us perfectly into our next topic. But I guess before we do that, I would love to open it up to the audience to see if you have any questions so far about anything that Simeon said, or if there's anything you would like us to address. First of all, is there anyone who
Yeah,
would like to?
a lot of these meta topics sometimes difficult to process. So concrete questions of your situations are welcome. We can talk about.
Give it a couple seconds. If anyone would like to talk, they can just feel free to unmute. And thank you for those who have sent a little blurb in the chat about some of your personal experiences.
So everything was perfectly clear. You're already doing it. You have absolutely no questions about how to do it well.
I have a question. Hi, I'm Charlotte Beckett. I'm CEO of a non-profit called Barakat Bundle. So we're not approaching investors and such because we're a non-profit, but we're looking at how we can become more sustainable. And we've done a number of pitches for grants and that kind of thing. But we're not a tech product as such, and we're also a group of women. And this is a question for my role with Barakat Bundle, but also generally, you mentioned the sort of bias and, more male investors than women, etc. Have you got any sort of top tips for women, or just generally as to how we can sort of overcome those challenges in pitches, and sort of the perception of confidence and experience and any kind of gender and sort of bias that there is in the room?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer it. In my experience, you have to understand what investors are ultimately trying to do, right? So again, sorry about the meta description, but those are the most adaptable to individual situations. And it's not even about investors. Think about donors, right? Think about anybody who is approached to commit meaningful amounts of capital to potentially challenging objectives, right? So somebody shows up and makes a number of statements about the future. Here's how the future will change. Here's what I will do with the resources you give me. And most of the time, certainly in the investing world, if investors believed everything they heard, that won't invest in every single company, right? If donors truly believed that the organizations that approached them could achieve all the objectives that they set themselves, they'll probably provide a lot more resources to nonprofits. The reality is that as an overwhelming evidence that what entrepreneurs say about the future is not true. Fundamentally not true. The world doesn't change the way entrepreneurs say it will change, and entrepreneurs do not accomplish what they claim they will with the capital that investors provide. Same thing with nonprofits. A lot of nonprofits, the program looks wonderful at the presentation time, and when you measure its impact, it's a lot fuzzier. Leading folks like Piero Migliar to essentially create a nonprofit to try to bring in some business practices into nonprofits to be able to better connect, inputs and outputs and understand the performance links. But fundamentally, at a meta level, then the conversation actually is not about the specifics of what you're pitching, but it's about trust. It's about specifically, do I trust what you're telling me about the future? And that at its core, if you understand it, you can then start adjusting for it, right? So I forget the study, but there definitely are vertical in the sense of industry and subject specific biases in the way, for example, men perceive men versus women making forward-looking statements in business. But there are also ways of expressing basically that there's ways to express the concept to try to correct some of the bias. And again, I'll simply dig. I advise you to dig for this type of research because a fair amount of it has been done. Second thing is, how does a person pitching present themselves, right? If you understand that it's ultimately about trust, you can even talk about your background as a story that's essentially related, goes along the lines of, gee, you know, at a point in time T, I saw something and I thought this about the future and I told the people and we did something together, and then the future came and look, it's what I said, or it was better than what I said, and so on and so forth. Part of the reason why investors like backing successful repeat entrepreneurs is not so much because of the proven track record of success, but because of the fact that they've essentially more trustworthy, right? In the pitch. So that's one area. Essentially, look at understand the meta process that's going on and start presenting yourself to fit into it. Look at some of the research around gender biases and the forms of presentation and communication that help address some of those. And ultimately, just look for investors that are focused not on who you are, but on what you can accomplish. It's hard. You simply have to have a lot of conversations, but you can pick things up fairly early in a conversation. And there's been a bunch of posting in the last couple of years around the Me Too movement of female entrepreneurs talking about their experiences raising money and the kinds of things they hear in first conversations. Again, you can find them, you can read them. If you hear these few key phrases, it's not that you can't raise money from that person. It's not even that that person may not be a great investor for your company to have. It's just that, like many things in life, you may have to do much better at pitching. Your company's numbers need to be better than somebody who's of a different gender or sometimes of a different color skin, raising money from that individual, which is really unfortunate, but is the sad reality of the world we live in. I'm not sure that was a helpful answer, but at least there are a few tools in there to work with.
Thank you.
And thanks for the question, Charlotte. I guess this would be a good time to talk a little bit more about like this the concept of like investor feedback, and especially since Sim has been on both sides of the table, both as an entrepreneur and also as an investor. I think it'd be great to I guess get a little bit of your insight on this topic, but since it is pretty broad and there's definitely a lot of things that we could talk about, in the interest of time, I think maybe we can like break it up into a couple specific topics, and then if anyone has questions along the way, feel free to shoot a message in the chat. You can private message me, or of course just like unmute and ask the question. But I think just to begin, I'm wondering like if you could talk a little bit about how we like what differences you see when we're approaching experts for feedback versus I guess non-experts, and I guess just like how to account for I guess those differences.
So there is a saying in the investing circles that if you hear an expert tell you that something is very, very valuable, you should probably trust them. If they tell you it's not going to be very valuable, then actually you have to be a lot more careful in how you interpret the feedback. And it has to do with essentially how much whatever it is you're pitching, whatever your idea is, changes the status quo. Right? Experts we all know that science is biased by the sort of gestalt of beliefs that it exists in, right? And so it's very difficult for anybody to become an expert in a subject without also absorbing the biases of the environment the subject is taught in. possible but unlikely. And so they may or may not be aware of these biases. And if your idea fundamentally changes the status quo in a way that is significantly different, then those biases may prevent somebody from seeing the value. So again, it's one of those judgment calls. Let's zoom out. If entrepreneurs stop doing whatever they were doing every time an expert told them it can't be done or it's not going to be valuable, a lot fewer companies, a lot fewer great companies would have come to be.
Mm-hmm. And I think just on this point of like adjusting or like to biases in in biases in like judgments and feedback, I think we like talk about like bias like based on gender. We've talked now like bias based on like expert status. I'm wondering if there's like any other larger sources of like bias you see that like does occur in feedback, whether that's like cultural aspects or things that are specific to maybe companies, perhaps like your own or companies that you've interacted with.
Sure. Cultural biases is huge in diligence feedback, whether it's you vetting your idea and trying to learn something, or whether it's investors trying to do due diligence to determine whether to invest in a startup. For example, in the US, it's inappropriate culturally to poo-poo someone's entrepreneurship ideas. So you're far less likely to get brutally negative feedback, even if it's brutally honest negative feedback. Instead, you're much more likely to get something like, it's interesting, tell me more, or like, let's talk again in a year, or something like that. And if you move to the meta level away from the specific situation, what are you basically telling a diligence contact? The fundamental setup is, dear X, would you like me to spend my time and other people's money to try to make your life better? What incentive does X have to say no? So you have to give them the incentive, right? You have to motivate them to give you strongly and openly negative feedback. And most entrepreneurs don't do that. They're bubbling with excitement. Not only do they not want to hear the negative feedback, let alone they don't want to spend any time trying to motivate people and explain to them why really, really negative feedback is important. So in eventual, we often call it the diligence bias. A whole number of companies have been funded that shouldn't have been funded because the experts that the VCs reached out to essentially gave these lukewarm positive answers around, yeah, it's interesting, if they built it, I'll be happy to talk to them, and things of that sort. So back to this notion of that often the people you're asking feedback from have no cost to have neither a benefit to give you the exact accurate feedback you need, and also have no cost to do the same. So they're sort of unconstrained, and they're in cultural aspects play. In other cultures, for example, Eastern Europe, Israel, it's much more common to hear somebody just tell you this is a really stupid idea. People are more comfortable with this type of expression, not so in Western Europe and the US. How do you deal with this? Well, you have to one, really explain to people and get them on board as to why negative feedback is actually very helpful, right? And other times, if they give you positive feedback, you have to validate whether it's true positive feedback. How do you do that? You have to get the person to absorb some type of cost, right? So for example, they say, yeah, it's a great idea. I say, fabulous, do you want to spend X many more hours with us, talking about it and learning about it and giving us your feedback? In the case of venture capitalists, they'll probably would not want to spend that many more hours, but there are other ways of figuring it out. will they make an introduction to somebody who's not necessarily easy to make an introduction to, but to somebody who is politically expensive in their social network to get an introduction to. So again, until you get somebody, call it diligence person or whoever, to take on a behavior that costs them something in support of your idea and in support of the positive feedback they've given you, you cannot be 100% certain of that feedback. Or you'd often find they give you, oh, this is super amazing, it's going to change the world. Yeah, great. Can you introduce me to 4 people who you think can be really helpful? Wants to listen. Oh, having a hard time thinking about who these people are. Also, you're a little early. Yeah, ping me again in 3 months. I'd question how positive that positive feedback was.
Yeah, I think that's terrific advice and like something that's like super tangible and something that's relatively like straightforward to ask, but like that doesn't get asked. And I think that's like a good way to, I guess, evaluate like, yeah, just like really how like true and how genuine like that kind of feedback is. Especially if like you're putting like your company and like your money and your time and effort like on the line. Like after hearing this positive feedback, I think it's like, yeah, so necessary for entrepreneurs and founders to ask these difficult questions, even if they produce answers that I guess we like don't always want to hear. I guess yeah, just on this, yeah. One last question, I guess, on this idea of investor feedback before, yeah, of course, like wanting to hear questions from the audience. But about this question or about this topic of, I guess, like extremes, I guess, extremes feedback in both like positive and negative senses. And I'm wondering, like, do you think like the burden falls on, I guess, the founder who's like talking, or more so on like the investor to, I guess, to provide some more of these like extreme types of feedback?
Burden is always on the shoulders of whoever wants it the most, right? So if I'm a founder of a company and I have certain objectives, right? It's my job to achieve these objectives. So, I'm hopeful other people may be aligned, but ultimately it's not their problem, it's my problem. Right? So the most valuable types of feedback are ones at the extremes. Like lukewarm, middle of the road feedback doesn't really help you decide whether it's going to go this way or that. Think of it this way. Like imagine you're a physicist who had just been working for years on a super, super complicated and expensive experimental setup to check something about the cosmos, right? And then you run your experiment and it comes up with an inconclusive result. Not very helpful. So lukewarm feedback or sort of lukewarm negative feedback is not particularly helpful. Extremely positive, extremely negative feedback is much more helpful. And in the case of extremely positive feedback, you want to vet it to make sure it's true.
Yes. Okay, thank you, yeah, for just that clarification. And yeah, just for like reinforcing, I guess, that idea. I guess just with our last 10 minutes, we'd love to hear some more questions from the audience. And just to kick us off, I have one that came through the chat that's asking a little bit more about, I guess, like your background and your experiences with your own startups. The audience members asking, like, out of the startups that like you founded or invested in, which has been, I guess, like a favorite or something that's like been super meaningful and stuck out to you, and why?
Wow. Should always be your latest startup, ideally. Oh goodness. My first startup built the first web application server. So we invented the modern way web applications were built and ran 10% of the dynamic internet in the 90s. Hard to sort of have more impact industry-wide. My latest startup, though, actually improves people's health. So although it's much smaller at this point and very, very different technically, I'd argue I hold it dearer to my heart simply because again, every company I've done has been in different industry and so many of them have evolved solving really, really difficult technical problems that, help the world in sort of do things better, do things cheaper, do things faster, more securely, etc. But the connection to actually improving individuals' lives more broadly is a bit tenuous, right? Has many steps. And my current company, we use AI to do a number of things around health, like for example, um, discover people who have undiagnosed rare diseases. Rare diseases in the US are defined as diseases that have fewer than 200,000 patients, as thousands of them. And on average, it takes about 5 years for one of them to be diagnosed, which is a huge amount of time. Tons of patient suffering, tons of cost in the healthcare system as you go from doctor to doctor to doctor. Imagine for 5 years having problems and not knowing what's causing them. So being able to help in situations like that is very meaningful to me and to our whole team.
Yeah, certainly. And that's I remember like when like reading through like your LinkedIn and looking through that, like that was also like one of the companies that like really jumped out. And yeah, just like the potential for impact I think is like huge. I guess yeah, if anyone else has another question, please just like shoot it in the chat or raise your hand. But another one, I guess, that came in was I'm wondering like if you like learned anything about entrepreneurship that like you, I guess, like didn't know coming in that like you were only able to learn after being involved in like the community for so long. And then on the flip side, a similar like the same question, but applied to like the investing sphere. Whether there's something that like from the outside, I guess, as entrepreneurs and as students, like we wouldn't know. But I guess only by going in the inside and being an investor that you were able to learn.
And the short answer to both questions is everything. I joined my first startup straight out of school. The internet was just getting started. There were no blog posts. I mean, blogging didn't exist. There was no information really about venture capital and venture capitalists. The tech bubble wasn't around, so it was the old process, of talking to people and learning from them. So I learned everything about entrepreneurship and about investing simply by the act of doing it. Not very smart that way, because as the saying goes, an hour in the library can usually save a week in the lab. But in our case, I was too busy with 3 majors, so and other people on the founding team also. So we just launched the startup and figured things out as we were going. Now, it was Bubble 1.0. It was the crazy days of the 90s, and so many of our mistakes were forgiven by very rapidly rising industries. Many of our mistakes, say in 2002, 2003, would have been fatal in a much tougher economic environment and a much tougher funding environment. So you can't forget the extent to which luck and timing plays a role. And when you think about your own success, you want to be able to separate those factors from your own abilities, because otherwise you have an inaccurate perception of your own abilities, and may get you in situations that you can't get yourself out of.
Thank you so much, yeah, for that response. And I think, yeah, a very like that was like a very like broad and general question. And definitely like so many things that you learned over the past like decades, but also that you've even like been able to share just like a little glimpse of that with us over this call. And for that, we're like so grateful. I'm thinking if there's no other questions, I guess, yeah, just a last call for questions. But if not, we can, I'll just like give Sim a huge thank you and virtual round of applause, of course. And yeah, just thank you so much for your time today. But yeah, opening it up one last time to see if there's any other last questions.
Your life as founders is just so easy and so simple. You have no troubles at all in your minds. Or maybe just Sunday afternoon.
Okay, I suppose on that note, so is there any way for founders who might be on this call or might be, I guess, like in the HECP network, that if they do have questions, perhaps not on a Sunday afternoon, any way that they could like contact you or reach out afterwards?
I'm easy to find. Tweet me. It's probably the easiest thing. Message me on LinkedIn. Noisier channel, but
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much again for your time today and for sharing both like large scale or like higher level pieces of advice, but also some like tangible actions that we can apply, especially when getting investor feedback. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining us as well. And I hope you all
have a great Sunday.
bye.
Bye.
Thank you.